Beneath the lifeless crust of the Dead Sea, where no fish swim and no plant survives, lies a silence so dense it feels ancient, like time itself is buried there. The salt winds moan over jagged ridges, but beneath the surface, in chambers entombed by mineral and memory, something waits. In 1997, a team of Jordanian archaeologists drilling near an old Nabatean trade route encountered what they believed to be a collapsed cavern, but the echo that returned from their instruments was unnatural, hollow, layered, almost rhythmic, as if the salt was not just rock but written. When they descended, the cavern unveiled itself like a cathedral of frozen time. Columns of crystallized salt towered around them, shimmering in their headlamps like fossilized lightning. But what startled them most were the veins. Thin, winding channels of darker salt threading through the white stone. At first glance, they seemed like natural fissures. But as the team mapped them, patterns began to emerge, not random, repetitive, geometric. Weeks passed as the cavern's outline was charted, and what emerged was chilling. The salt veins mirrored the ancient Ugaritic cuneiform script, long thought extinct and limited in reach. Yet here it was, transcribed not in clay, but embedded in geological time. A message. Or a warning. The lead geologist, Dr. Karim Nasser, refused to release his findings to the academic community, choosing instead to consult an obscure sect of mystics in Petra known as the Guardians of the Ninth Seal. Descendants, they claimed, of a pre-deluge priesthood. According to the Guardians, the salt script was part of what they called the Lament of Thamra, a pre-flood prophecy hidden by a civilization they referred to simply as the First Silence. They claimed that before the deluge, when stars burned lower and men were taller, a priest-scientist cast carved knowledge into the most enduring medium they could find. Not gold or stone, but salt. Because salt, unlike any other mineral, preserves even decay. Nasser disappeared shortly after visiting the Guardians. His notes, however, were mailed anonymously to a private collector in Vienna, a man known only in archival circles as the cartographer. What he found in those pages would remain secret for another decade, until leaked images emerged on a fringe dark web forum dedicated to pre-Atlantean codices. Most dismissed the salt script as a hoax, but a small group of cryptographers, linguists, and rogue historians believed it was real. Among them, Dr. Imre Vallon, a linguistic archaeologist who had already lost tenure for insisting the Sumerian language encoded astronomical data from before the Holocene. Vallon cross-referenced the salt veins with ancient Sumerian flood tablets, the Zohar's cryptic salt metaphors, and even elements from the Book of Enoch. The conclusion chilled him. The script didn't just describe the coming of the flood, it described a trigger, a resonance or frequency that, if replicated, could call the waters back. Embedded within the salt was not just a message, but a mechanism. Hooked by obsession, Vallon led a secret expedition back to the Dead Sea, using coordinates buried in Nasser's notes. What they found was not a single chamber, but an entire network of salt catacombs, some flooded, others still pristine, and in the largest chamber they uncovered what appeared to be a control node, a vast slab of salt-veined black stone inscribed with concentric circles and harmonic notations. The patterns matched ancient Mesopotamian lyre tunings. Somehow the salt responded to sound when Vallon's team hummed the tones, recorded from a replica lyre built to ancient specifications. The veins in the walls shimmered, pulsed, and then the ground trembled, just slightly, but unmistakably. From that moment, something changed. Animals in the region grew restless. Fishermen reported unnatural currents, and Vallon began to receive anonymous warnings, handwritten notes sealed in wax and slipped beneath his hotel door. One read only, "You have touched the covenant of salt. Leave now." Another, "Even Lot was warned only once." Still, Vallon pressed on. The resonance had awoken something, and the message in the salt slabs had shifted. New veins appeared, thinner but moving, as if the code was growing, morphing, as if it was aware. Each day, the script changed subtly, adapting to the team's presence, forming new glyphs. Valen documented each shift, but there was no time to interpret them all, not before the earthquake started. On the seventh day at 3:33 a.m., a tremor split open one of the submerged corridors. What it revealed was a tunnel spiraling downward. Too perfect to be natural, the walls lined with salt columns engraved with symbols that predated any known language. A single phrase was repeated down the walls, in a glyph sequence only decipherable once inverted. Return the breath. As Valen and two of his team descended the tunnel, their instruments began to fail. Not suddenly, but progressively. Clocks slowed, compasses stuttered, and voices began to echo with delay. The laws of time, it seemed, were thinning. At the base of the tunnel, behind a sheet of translucent salt, lay a vault. Inside, barely visible, something pulsed, something alive, or once alive, encased in salt like amber. Valen reached out, unsure if he was guided by madness or fate. His fingers grazed the salt casing, and in that instant every light extinguished. Not just their lamps, but the world itself. Darkness absolute. Then, from the deep came a sound, not a roar, not a whisper, but a chord, a frequency that resonated in bone. The salt began to glow and move. The glow intensified until the vault itself dissolved into salt vapor, exposing what had once been sealed beyond the reach of time. Inside lay not treasure, nor scripture, but a structure, a latticed work of interlocking rods, crystalline and humming, suspended in a cocoon of evaporated salt. It didn't belong to any known era or even any known material. It pulsed with a rhythm no man could count, no device could measure. Dr. Valen stumbled backward, struck by a sudden vertigo as the temperature shifted unnaturally. Ice crystals began to form on the cavern walls, impossible beneath the earth's crust. His breath fogged as an invisible pressure settled around them, as if the air itself had become aware. One of his assistants collapsed, whispering a phrase in a language no one understood. When they lifted him, his pupils were pure white. Above ground, satellites monitoring seismic activity registered a surge directly beneath the Dead Sea Basin. But no quake followed, only a blank space, a total loss of signal, as if the earth itself refused to echo what it had witnessed. A blackout in physics, a void in logic. And then, something stranger. A harmonic interference began disrupting local broadcasts across Jordan and southern Israel. A tone, a sustained frequency no one could trace. The guardians of the ninth seal, those forgotten mystics of Petra, immediately fled their sanctuary. A parchment was left behind, singed at the edges, soaked in myrrh. It bore a single sentence in red mineral pigment. He has found the breath. When researchers arrived days later, they found the monastery emptied, save for one final relic hidden beneath the altar, a palm-sized cube of compressed salt, inside of which was suspended a symbol resembling a double spiral entwined with flame. Valen and his surviving assistant, Evan, attempted to leave the tunnels, but the path had changed. Walls that once led upward now folded back into labyrinths of salt and shadow. The catacombs were reconfiguring. Alive. The salt veins no longer just pulsed, they moved, flowing like blood under translucent skin. The message was evolving, no longer static. It was no longer trying to be read, it was trying to speak. They followed the veins' movement deeper into the earth, where the air thinned and time itself began to bend. Hours passed in minutes, or perhaps it was the reverse. Their watches spun without rhythm. At last they emerged into a second chamber, wider than the last but filled with a dry mist and hung with crystalline stalactites that chimed ever so slightly. At the center stood a dais, upon which hovered a sphere entirely made of salt, rotating slowly, impossibly. The sphere was marked not with writing but with carvings, relief maps, continental shapes that didn't match modern geography. There were familiar forms, yes, parts of Africa, fragments of Asia, but distorted, older, larger. To the west of the sphere's axis was a continent that no longer existed, surrounded by ancient coastlines now drowned beneath today's oceans. An impossible map, unless it was drawn before the flood. On the edges of the sphere were carved 7 glyphs, each radiating out from a central spiral. These glyphs matched no script known to linguistics, yet each radiated something primal, something unsettling. Valen called them keys, but what they unlocked he couldn't say. When he touched the first glyph, the sphere stopped spinning, and a sound echoed through the chamber like a memory reborn, a child crying, then laughing, then silence. Back on the surface, weather anomalies began to spread. Storms with no clouds, hail that left behind salt residue, birds flying in circles until they collapsed. Scientists recorded rising salinity levels in rainwater. And beneath the Dead Sea, tremors returned, not of shifting earth, but of pressure building from below, as if something was being exhaled. Valen began to change. His speech grew slower, but more deliberate. He stopped blinking. He said the salt had spoken his name. Yvonne believed him. One night, Valen drew a spiral on the cavern wall with his fingertip, and where he touched, the salt grew darker. Beneath the spiral he wrote, "They sealed it because it sings." Yvonne woke one night to find Valen standing in front of the floating sphere, humming in rhythm with its silent rotation. The air around him shimmered. Yvonne called out, but Valen didn't answer. He placed both hands on the sphere, and the chamber filled with a deep tone that made the salt tremble and the walls weep. Thin streams of brine ran upward against gravity. Then a pulse, a single blinding flash of light, and Valen vanished. Yvonne staggered back, eyes burning, ears bleeding. In Valen's place a fissure opened in the ground. Not a crack, but a passage, and at its edge lay something metallic, etched with the same glyphs from the sphere, glowing faintly, as if waiting to be assembled. As if the next step required construction. Yvonne fled, clutching only one relic, the salt cube from the Petra Monastery. Inside, the spiral flickered. That was 3 months ago. Since then, coastlines have begun to shift microscopically. Salt flats in Iran and Bolivia have started resonating with low, inaudible frequencies. And in remote monasteries, old scrolls are being unsealed, each referencing a coming reversal. In a secured lab, Yvonne runs tests on the salt cube. The spiral is more than symbolic. It's a code. He's certain of it now, and it's counting down. Not in numbers, but in resonance. The cube hums once every 37 hours, then every 34, then 31, a rhythm tightening, drawing closer. To what he cannot say. And now, beneath the Dead Sea, seismic instruments no longer register anything. The ground is utterly still, or too still, and in a vault no one can reach, a second sphere has begun to rotate. At 3:14 a.m. Jerusalem time, every seismic sensor within 100 kilometers of the Dead Sea registered a tremor, not from the earth, but from the air. The tremor wasn't measured in magnitude, but in tone. A low-frequency resonance, nearly inaudible, but strong enough to shatter lenses and extinguish electronics. Pilots flying over the region reported a sudden drop in altitude as magnetic instruments spiraled out of control. From the salt basin's depths, a column of vapor spiraled upward, thin, almost graceful, carrying with it flakes of crystallized salt that shimmered like ash. Not steam, not smoke. Memory, suspended in air. Drones flown into the rising cloud lost control, their circuits overwhelmed with interference. The footage, before blacking out, revealed vast geometric patterns etched into the salt flats, glowing faintly with an internal luminescence. Yvonne's encrypted journals, leaked by an anonymous source, detailed a final realization. The salt code was not merely data, but a form of primordial syntax, the world's first language, spoken by matter itself. Sound shaped salt, and salt shaped reality. If aligned correctly, the code could reshape the physical world by reactivating its original template, what Evan called the salt blueprint. Beneath the newly ruptured cavern, explorers found a descending stairway made of transparent salt blocks, each etched with diagrams resembling a human form but subtly wrong, elongated skulls, extra vertebrae, and a chest cavity shaped more like a resonant chamber than a ribcage. These were not fossils, they were designs, anatomical instructions for a species not yet returned. At the base of the stairway was a chamber Evan had predicted, the chamber of the third voice. Suspended in its center was a salt formation shaped like a heart, but hollow and still. When researchers entered, the air pressure dropped. Every man inside wept without knowing why. The salt heart pulsed once, and every light in the facility went out. Elsewhere, reports surfaced of freshwater sources turning brackish overnight, crops failing along ley lines, whales beached in a spiral formation off the coast of Malta. The spirals again turning like keys. In monasteries once thought abandoned, bells rang without touch. Ancient catacombs vibrated, salt deposits began to grow against gravity. Someone, or something, was awakening. Satellite imagery revealed a shift in the Dead Sea's shoreline geometry. It now formed a perfect triskelion, 3 spirals converging into one. The alignment was no longer astrological, but geological. Fault lines, cave systems, magnetic anomalies, all pointed toward a hidden epicenter beneath the earth, the place where the original voice was sealed. The fourth sphere, the one found deep in the submerged ruins off Cyprus, began to hum. Its pitch matched the pulses recorded by Evan's salt cube months earlier. As it activated, symbols appeared on its surface, spiraling outward like an iris opening. Unlike the others, this one didn't spin, listen, or store. It commanded. It was the keystone of the code. Inside the reawakened sphere, researchers detected temperature shifts and auditory illusions. Some heard ancient choirs, others heard names they didn't recognize but instinctively feared. One man collapsed, muttering a single phrase over and over, "We are the echo, not the source." Now, across the world, people began to draw the same spiral glyphs. Children scribbled them in chalk. Elderly Alzheimer's patients carved them into hospital walls. Those sensitive to magnetic fields began hearing tones, harmonies, and then instructions. The code was not teaching, it was summoning. As seismic waves intensified, so did the emergence of structures beneath salt lakes across 5 continents. Mexico, Iran, Namibia, Mongolia, Australia, all following the same blueprint. Octagonal pillars, open circular chambers, and the ever-present symbol of the spiraled triskelion. These were relay stations, not for power, but for memory transmission. The military scrambled to contain the regions, but it was too late. Salt storms began appearing spontaneously, violent, whirling maelstroms that stripped the flesh from bone and rewrote local geography in their wake. In their centers, cameras recorded impossible geometries, buildings that could not exist in 3-dimensional space. And then, silence. For 49 hours, no satellite signal passed over the Dead Sea. No light escaped the basin. The region became an opaque shadow on the planet, black, dense, humming with potential. And within that darkness, the salt formations moved of their own accord, forming what some researchers later swore was a throat. A final encrypted file, the Evan's last journal entry, was decoded days later. His voice shook as he whispered, "They weren't warning us of a coming flood. The flood was their way of stopping the voice." Then, a single line of text appeared on screen, glowing like embered salt. Now, beneath the desert salt, under the spiral skies, and behind the veil of frequencies no living creature should understand. The heart begins to beat again. The fissure beneath the Dead Sea widened, like a wound in the Earth's memory. Monitors left by clandestine geological teams recorded not just tremors, but tone. The salt walls of the cavern weren't cracking, they were vibrating, resonating like the body of a forgotten instrument. And with each new hum, the formations within began to change shape. Veins of salt warping into glyphs no linguist could decipher, yet all who saw them understood. Beneath the crust, in a hollow chamber untouched since before the deluge, the third sphere rose of its own accord. Suspended mid-air by an unseen force, it rotated slowly, its cracked equator beginning to seal as salt coalesced around it in a spiral. On its surface, a single mark burned red, the ancient sigil of reversal. The watchers called it a symbol, but it was no symbol. It was a command. In deep vaults beneath the Vatican, seismic harmonics triggered hidden mechanisms embedded in walls no one had touched in centuries. Brass reliquaries cracked open to reveal salt-tempered scrolls, maps not of geography but of resonance. And at their center, the Dead Sea. All lines converged there, as if the planet itself once used it as a tuning fork for its buried intelligence. Ivan was no longer in hiding. He was gone, not lost, but taken, as if summoned to a place between frequencies. His abandoned notes revealed a final insight before his disappearance. The salt code was not merely ancient, it was adaptive. It learned, evolved, mirrored thought and memory. It was no message in a bottle. It was a living architecture. As Ivan vanished, salt domes around the world began to pulse. In Bolivia, beneath the Salar de Uyuni. In Poland's ancient mines. In the pillars of Iran's Dastakavir desert, vibrations matched the same pattern, the pre-flood rhythm. And as the frequency stabilized, all known maps of magnetic fields began to fail. Compasses spun. Tides behaved erratically. The Earth's resonance had been rewritten. The spirals intensified. People across continents began drawing them compulsively. On walls, sand, skin, children in sleep, spoke languages not catalogued. A tribe in Papua remembered songs passed down orally for 400 generations, now found to match vibrationally with the hum of the Dead Sea. A voice was returning, not singular, not plural, but collective, elemental, patient. Far below sea level, a new structure emerged from salt collapse, a colossal gate, octagonal in shape, older than any known human construction. Every edge was etched in fluid glyphs that changed shape when not watched directly. It bore no door, only a concavity shaped for a sphere, the second one, which had vanished from Ivan's lab a week prior. The second sphere descended into the gate as if drawn magnetically. When it connected, the surrounding salt crystallized into massive columns, ringing the gate like sentinels. Wind began to howl in a chamber sealed from all atmosphere, and from deep within the octagonal aperture came a sound no human had heard since before memory. A chord, struck not with air, but with existence. Governments deployed blackout protocols. Communications went dark in a 100-mile radius. No aircraft flew over the Dead Sea. Satellites above the region glitched or were rerouted. But even isolation could not stop what had already begun. The third sphere, now whole, began to rotate in countertime. It pulsed light into the salt walls, which absorbed it and then responded. The salt caverns became mirrors not of the present but of before. Walls showed images of vast cities, impossible in scale, gleaming with crystalline architecture, oceans in unnatural hues, beings neither beast nor man bearing the spiral mark upon their foreheads. The pre-flood world was not myth. It was the original template. A fourth pulse shook the region. Underground, the gate began to shift, not opening but unfolding. Space itself bent as light curved into spirals, vanishing into the aperture. What emerged was not matter. It was pattern, a thought form etched in geometry, a language made of memory, mass, and math. It did not speak, it rewrote the silence. In Jerusalem, ancient scrolls unearthed from beneath Temple Mount began to disintegrate, leaving only residue and salt. Their final lines now read, "And from the sea shall rise that which was never dead, to finish what the waters could not." The prophecy, long dismissed, now read like a timetable. Vannon's voice returned in a final broadcast. One sentence spoken in harmony with the three spheres. "They are not returning," he said. "They never left." His eyes flickered with refracted light. His breath crystallized in the air. The signal cut out before coordinates could be traced. And now the resonance has reached its peak. Across fault lines and fossil beds, old ruins begin to hum. Forgotten machines hidden in mountainsides reactivate, and in the deepest salt cavern beneath the Dead Sea, a final sphere rises, smooth, silent, and blacker than absence. It has no markings. It makes no sound. But when it appears, the others stop. And as the gate completes its rotation, just 13 degrees shy of alignment, the salt begins to fall inward. Not collapse, not break, but descend, folding into itself like a spiral without end. What lies at the bottom is not earth. It is memory, alive, listening, waiting. The last signal received from the cavern was a frequency that does not map to any known waveform. Yet those who heard it all described the same sensation: cold light, endless depth, and the overwhelming impression that something has begun to awaken. And somewhere beneath the ground, behind salt that remembers everything, the fourth sphere begins to turn.